It
Friedman.
is, it is my great pleasure to have a very special guest today who will, I don't know how to start, answer all the big questions of life. And the questions that I think, you and I have really been struggling with, which are questions about struggle and suffering and pain and loss and anxiety, because we do feel at times overwhelmed by it, right? And sometimes when we are in the midst of the pain and the suffering, we do feel also that there is a sense of feeling lost for answers. And then we have two choices. We're so used to in our society to actually feel comfortable, trying to be in control at all times and just planning ahead and basically knowing what the outcome will be. And then life happens and it doesn't happen our way. And then something happens that causes us anxiety or doubt or maybe pain or hurt. And then we have these two choices where we either just try to ignore it, distract ourselves from it, take a few pharmaceuticals, or just go into some instant pleasure and enjoyment to not have to feel the pain or the suffering. Or when we cannot ignore it anymore, we become so focused on it. It just becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and it is all encompassing. And all of a sudden, the anxiety and the insecurity defines not only our day, it defines our life, it defines ourselves. Now, as we are going through suffering, we obviously have a problem on how do we deal with it. And here come the ancient mystics like Rumi that are teaching us to embrace suffering even when it's painful. Embrace suffering as just a symptom that is ultimately a sign that our closed hearts are opening up. And that's what Rumi said. Rumi says wounds are the places where the light enters. Yes. Suffering is a gift in its hidden mercy. And he also says pains are messengers. Do not turn away from these foolish ones. Well, that sounds all wonderful and great, but how do we do this? How can we go through suffering with greater grace and ease? How can we start embracing suffering as teachers, as transformational times in our lives without really getting completely absorbed in the discomfort? And that is where I have this wonderful guest today, which is Kamla Kapur. She is the author of several books, but her newest book is Rumi, Tales of the Spirit. And I have to say, sometimes you come across books that really touch you. And when you read them, you just feel like there is so much truth that comes out of every page. And this book that Kamla wrote is a book with the with some stories of Rumi, but then also her commentary, her interpretation, her personal story. So it's a really rich book full of life lessons and full of also bridges to hope and deeper understanding. So it's my great pleasure to have Kamla on the show. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Friedman.
Yeah, I really loved your book, and Rumi is someone I have always enjoyed because simple sentences and concepts he just finds the most beautiful words for, and there's just the wisdom in what he's teaching. But for those of us that may never have heard about Rumi, who is Rumi, and how did you become interested in him?
Well, Rumi was a 13th century ordinary person like you and me, going about business as usual, studying law. He was a nobleman. He, we would never have heard of Rumi if it weren't for a huge tragedy in his life. And the tragedy, was preceded by a marvelous gift, which was the entrance into his life of a wandering minstrel called Shams. And Rumi absolutely fell in love with him. And of course, we don't know whether this love was physical or metaphysical. And in the end, it doesn't matter, because physical and metaphysical are on a continuum, and one learns the one uh, into the other. So he met him and he fell in love with him, and just a few years later he lost him. Some say he was murdered by all Rumi's son, for example, who was very jealous of his relationship with Shams. So this death caused a deep wound in Rumi, and from this wound sprang the 6 volumes of the Matnavi, which have survived for 800 years. So somebody suggested to him, why not write about your pain? And so his book starts with, listen to the reed, how it complains of separations, lamenting, ever since I was removed from the reed bed, my lament has caused men and women to moan. So Rumi makes it very clear that it is our separation. It is the reed that was separated from its matrix, from the whole universe, its connection to the whole universe, that makes it sing and that makes it lament about separation. So that is the root cause of all our suffering. And if you want to put it in a more direct way, you can widen it and say, this connection that we bemoan, that we feel we don't have, is to the entire universe, and which we forget. I mean, we are so sort of shrouded in our own selves that we don't allow ourselves to get out of it and face the sun, as Rumi would call it. I mean, turn from the shadow of your ego and face the sun. Or you could even call it God.
Right.
And so it depends on what your philosophy is, and what you could call it nature, and it all means the same thing, which is something vast in us, to which we were connected, but from which we have either separated ourselves, or from which the times have separated us, or from which our pursuit of too much business as usual has separated us. So that is the very foundation from which Rumi starts. And I got into Rumi actually because I have always been interested in ways to get out of suffering, to mitigate my suffering, because I'm just a human, and I don't have the answers to everything, but I do have the answers to some things that have made my life so much better. Mm-hmm. And my interest in Rumi sprang from my interest in wanting to tell tales from each tradition, from many traditions, in order to show that the message and the roots are the same for all of us, whether it's Christian or Jewish, or I've written books from the Hindu tradition, from the Sikh tradition, from the Islamic tradition. And so Rumi was given to me as a gift, actually. I just found him on the shelves of my husband's bookcase when I moved in with him, and I was very attracted to him. And those first few lines about the reed just pulled me in, like I was like a fish that was being reeled in. It's like it was like I was hooked. I knew I had to work with Rumi. And I had heard about Rumi as a poet, but I hadn't known that Rumi was a storyteller. And so when I found that he was a storyteller, and I'm basically a storyteller, I wanted to tell some of retell and recreate some of his stories, because Rumi is very frustrating to read. You know, you got these 6 huge volumes that are set up, written at a time when people had time. And so he could digress, he could discourse, he could flow like a river, something that we have forgotten how to do. And so he flowed from poetry to story and story to story, leaving one, you know, in the first volume and then getting to it in the second, and sometimes not even ending it, you know. So I had to invent names of the characters. I had to invent sometimes the endings of the stories, and I had to develop them for a modern audience, because we like stories that are detailed. And so I basically went into them, and just like I recreated stories from the Sikh and the Hindu tradition, I recreated it from the Sufi tradition. And Sufism is the mystical version of Islam, just like we have in the Christian tradition, we have the Bible, and then we have the Gnostic Gospels, which gives everything a mystical spin. And
Right.
by mystical, I mean a broader vision of the universe, something that connects us to everybody and religion.
Well, I love that you were navigating so nicely through the river of Rumi's writings and teachings. And after the break, we will delve into it, because some of the findings that you have brought with you are just marvelous. And so when we come back, we'll talk about that big question when we suffer of why. Why does it happen to me? Why does God let this happen? And how do we reconcile with that question? We will be right back.